Hi there guys, so today we are going to try something new. At home you are watching this video on the noun or the jobs that nouns and pronouns do. Now as we do this, I want you to do something for me. The first time I just want you to watch this video. The one thing that tends to happen in class is that you're trying to take notes while I'm talking because you need to take notes, but then you're not seeing everything that's taking place. So watch the video first and just listen to it. And then the second time you can go through and take notes. And the nice thing about this is since you all take notes at different speeds, you'll be able to go back and pause and rewind wherever you need. Okay, so let's get started. So the first type of job that nouns and pronouns can do is that they can act as subjects in a sentence. So there's two different types of subjects. The first kind of subject is a simple subject, and that is when the noun or a pronoun performs an action, just a single one. So if we look at the example, the turtle runs down the hill, the subject in this sentence is turtle. So we're going to circle that so you can see it. There's also a compound subject, and a compound subject is when we have two or more nouns that share the same verb. So if we look at the sentence, the turtle and the bunny run down the hill, run is still our verb, but we have two different animals running. The first would be the turtle, and the second would be the bunny. So that's the first part, okay? Simple subjects, compound subjects. Nouns can always act as subjects. Let's move on. Nouns and pronouns can also be objects of prepositions, and that's when we have prepositional phrases. So you've done this before. When the object comes after the preposition, you have a prepositional phrase, and we mark it using brackets. So in the sentence, the turtle runs down the hill, our preposition is down, so we know that the prepositional phrase starts there, so we're going to put a bracket around it. And what do they run down? The hill. So we know our prepositional phrase ends there. Since down is our preposition, down what? The hill. We'll mark that as our preposition object, a PO. Now, in the second sentence, after sunset, the turtle runs down the hill. Well, we just saw that down the hill is a prepositional phrase. So we're going to mark that again. We know it starts at down. We know it ends at hill, so we'll put brackets around it. Down what? The hill. So we'll mark that as our prepositions object, PO. But we have another prepositional phrase in this sentence, okay? If you look at the beginning, prepositional phrases can also come at the beginning of sentences, and they're followed by commas. So we're going to put brackets around after sunset, because we know that after is our preposition, and after what? The sunset. We'll mark that as our PO for our prepositions object. Okay. Now, if you're having some trouble figuring out what prepositions are, you probably need to go back to your notes from last year, or even the year before that. You need to look at notes from me or Mrs. Lott, or you can also look them up in your workbook. Let's move on. Okay. Nouns and pronouns, again, another job. They can also be direct objects. And direct objects tell what or who receives the action of an action verb, okay? So you ask what or whom in order to find them. Now we've talked about a few jobs already. So the big thing you want to do is that most sentences are going to have prepositional phrases if they're longer. So you always want to mark the prepositional phrase first. So if we look at the example at the bottom, we have Mrs. Robeson asks a question to the class. Now we know to is a preposition, so we're going to put our first bracket before the to. Who does she ask the question to? She asks it to the class. So we know our prepositional phrase ends here, and class is the object of our preposition, so our PO. Now, we need to find the subject, because every sentence, if it's complete, is going to have a subject. So Mrs. Robeson is our subject in this sentence. So we're going to mark it with an S. And then we need to find the action verb. And here's the thing. Action verbs are the verbs that have direct objects and what we'll see later as indirect objects. So you always want to kind of look at your verb and figure out what kind of verb you have. So ask is our verb. And then we move on to step 4. We ask what or whom. So we use the subject when we ask this question. Mrs. Robeson asks what? She asks a question. So the question is our direct object. And we're going to mark it with a DO. Moving on. Nouns and pronouns can also be indirect objects. And this is where it gets a bit tricky, is you have to make sure that you're following steps. And I hope you're following the direction from the beginning where you're not taking notes yet. Because at the end, it's going to give you all the steps in one little format to follow. That will be really helpful. So just make sure you're watching. Okay, so indirect objects tell to whom or to what, and sometimes it's for whom or for what, the action is done. Now this is the real big thing here. You can only have an indirect object in between the action verb and the direct object. If it's not there, you just don't have one. Okay? So to find the direct object, we're going to go through the same process. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look for prepositional phrases. So look at the sentence at the bottom. And the directions in blue we've already done. The directions in red are the ones that are new. So, after class, Mrs. Robeson asked Sally a question. Our prepositional phrase, if we look at the beginning, is after class, and we definitely want to make sure we mark that so we don't end up missing the subject. Okay? So, after is our preposition, class is our preposition's object, so we're going to mark that. The second step is to mark the subject. Mrs. Robeson asked Sally the question. Since the subject is the main idea, it would be Mrs. Robeson, so we're going to mark it with an S as the subject. Then we're going to find our action verb. Our action verb is ask. That's the action that's taking place, so we're going to mark it with a V for the verb. Ask what or whom to mark the direct object. So we have both. And so this is where you really need to pay attention and ask the questions that you need to ask. So we start with Mrs. Robeson asked what? Okay? She asked a question. That's our direct object. So we mark it with the DO. Now, we move on to step 6, and this is how you always check your action or your direct objects versus your indirect objects. We go, Mrs. Robeson asked a question to whom? And since we have Sally, and it comes in between our action verb and our direct object, or I'm sorry, between our action verb and our direct object, we know Sally is our indirect object. So we're going to mark it with an IO. Hopefully we're following along, and we're almost done. We have one more other type of job that we're going to look at. And this is when a noun or a pronoun can act as a subject complement. In the subject complement, you've done this last year, you have two types. You have a predicate nominative and a predicate adjective. And we're just focusing on nouns and pronouns now, so we're going to look at the predicate nominative. And that's when you have a noun that comes after a linking verb that renames the subject. So, the big thing that you want to think of here is that direct objects and indirect objects only work with verbs and action verbs. Okay? Predicate nominatives and other subject complements only work with linking verbs. So to find our predicate nominative, oh, little mistake here. Okay? To find our predicate nominative, the first thing you're going to do is you're still marking the prepositional phrase if you have one. let's look at the sentence at the bottom. The English teacher is Mrs. Robeson. Now, we don't have a prepositional phrase, and that's fine. So we've still done our step, we just don't need to do anything else. So then we go through and we're going to mark our subject. And our subject in this sentence is teacher. And then we need to find our linking verb. And our linking verb is. And hopefully you remember all of your linking verbs. But again, if you don't, that's okay. You can always go back and you can look in your workbook to get a list of them. So now we mark our predicate nominative. So we look for the noun or the pronoun renaming the subject. Now, in this sentence, Mrs. Robeson is who the teacher is, so we know that Mrs. Robeson is our predicate nominative. All right, let's put this together and do some examples. Step-by-step process. When you're taking your notes, this is the big thing that you want to write down. Let's move that out of the way. The first thing you always want to do, that you saw me do in this video, is you always mark your prepositional phrases first, because it's really easy to accidentally mark something in a prepositional phrase as an object or a subject if you don't get them out of the way. After that, you find your subject, and then you find your verb and determine if it's an action verb or if it's a linking verb. Now look at the big line that goes down the middle. You have two different steps of directions if it's an action verb or if it's a linking verb. If it's an action verb, you find the verb and you ask yourself the questions we practiced. The first one, you ask what or whom to find the direct object. And then you would ask to what or to whom to find the indirect object. And remember that you can only have an indirect object if it's coming in between the action verb and the direct object. Now, if it's a linking verb, you're going to find your linking verb, and then you're going to mark the noun or the pronoun that renames the subject. Here's a few examples. Now, feel free to pause the video and try to mark all of the nouns and the verbs in this first, and then to come back and look at the answers. But let's go through the answers as well. In the first sentence, we have after school, the student works on her essay. We have two prepositional phrases. We have after school, and school is our predicate object. And we have on her essay. And essay is our predicate's object. Or I'm sorry, it's our prepositional phrases object. Now, the student works, that's what we're left with. So we look for our subject next, and our subject is student, so we'll mark that with an S. And works is an action verb, so we'll mark our verb. But if we look afterwards, essay is already the object of the preposition. So if we ask the question, the student works what, you might have marked essay as a direct object if you didn't already know that it was in a prepositional phrase. So you need to make sure you do that first. This is why that part is so important. Don't forget that step. In the next sentence, we have Sally and Sam are students. So again, we look for prepositional phrases. In this case, there aren't any. So we're just going to start with our subjects. And here we have a compound subject. We have Sally and we have Sam. When we look for a verb, we have our linking verb are. And if we look, since we know it's a linking verb, we're going to look for our predicate nominative, and that comes right after, and that is students. So we're actually going to stop there. Please definitely do the next two questions, and we're going to go over those at the beginning of class tomorrow. I hope this has helped.